So China is in a lot of turmoil right now, and every single week brings new problems to the surface at the moment. Last week then was absolutely no different, and on the whole it was characterized by the insanity and the threat of war over this whole thing about Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. On top of that though, China is suffering from a declining economy. Its people are suffering as well with a CCP, a Communist Party policy that shoots itself in the foot over and over again. Today, of course, we're going to go through and discuss all of that and more and basically explain exactly what happened in China over the last week. Now, of course, the big news story, as I said, was that Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, went on her trip to Taiwan. Now, personally, I really don't like her. I don't like her politics at all. I don't like the fact that she's enriched herself off of insider trading, and I think that she's a typically selfish politician. But she is a politician and a very important one, a high-ranking figure at that, and she represents Democrats in the US and the President Biden and the White House and the entirety of America too. Now, she obviously went on a trip around a bunch of different Asian US allies last week, visiting countries like South Korea and Japan, and there were a lot of different rumors that she would visit Taiwan as well. Now, Taiwan is a special kind of China. They had a big civil war about 70 years ago, and one side, the communist side, basically won and took control of the mainland of the country, but the other side lost, except for it managed to hold on to the island of Taiwan, and it's basically just now the Taiwanese government. The relations between the two states, though, are still really quite bad, and both sides refuse to acknowledge the existence and the legitimacy of the other government and their control over the country itself. Now, just by nature of China being far larger than Taiwan and far more important economically and geopolitically, most countries don't officially recognize Taiwan, and so it's this kind of weird pseudo-state where it's kind of a country and kind of not. Now, government officials visiting Taiwan gives legitimacy to the country and its government, and Nancy Pelosi is the highest level government official to visit Taiwan in a couple of decades, so the CCP, the Communist Party, and China were very visibly unhappy at the prospect of her going over to Taiwan. Now, at first, this started off just with rumors that she would visit, and as a result of that, China wanted to make it clear that they weren't happy about this and that they would try to ensure that she doesn't visit the country, so they started to make threats. Now, they made a whole load of different threats. They said that they would basically start a war over this, that Pelosi flying into Taiwan would be akin to an invasion of China as a whole. They said that they would shoot down any fighter jets which escorts Nancy Pelosi. They said that they would shoot down her plane itself and actually kill her. There were threats of war and violence basically all over the place for the last week. At the end of the day, though, Pelosi did visit Taiwan and China didn't shoot anything down. They didn't really take any action to try and stop it from happening. They did still, though, respond in a bunch of different ways because they were absolutely furious at the US, and so they did take a load of different actions. Firstly, they called Pelosi vicious and provocative, and they released a whole load of sanctions against her personally. They then fired a bunch of missiles out from mainland into the sea surrounding Taiwan and near Japan as well, and actually some of these missiles landed inside Taiwan's economic zone of control. They also started a whole bunch of military exercises, again around Taiwan to try and intimidate them. They sent loads of warplanes around and warships as well. They enacted a list of economic sanctions against Taiwan, banning food exports, sand exports, and they announced that a bunch of tech companies would not be allowed to work with anyone related to Taiwan either. Then they summoned the American ambassador to China and they chastised him for his actions and for his role in it, and they said that the United States must pay for their mistakes. Then they cancelled a meeting that China had with the G7, and basically because the G7 condemned China's actions on the whole. And then finally, they unleashed a whole load of cyber attacks against Taiwan, targeting specifically government-led websites and organizations. In short, obviously China was very angry at the actions that the Americans chose to take, but what has the US done in response to that? Well, a bunch of congressmen and senators actually want to extend their further support to Taiwan and recognize them as a major non-NATO ally. Now, the Biden administration doesn't want this because they don't want to anger Taiwan, because frankly, America has enough problems on their plate at the moment, and this would almost certainly damage Biden's and the Democrats' re-election prospects if things go downhill here. Pelosi has given a couple of speeches since then, and in one of them, she tried to ease Chinese-US relations by adding this very weird anecdote when she spoke about how when she was a little girl, she was told that she could dig straight down to China, and as a result of that, there's always been this very special connection between America and China. It was a really weird thing to say, to be honest, but really it was just some very minor attempt to try and undo some of the problems that were caused over the last week. Now, the White House and the Biden administration in particular are saying the same sort of stuff, trying to stop tensions from getting any worse, and they are opposing the proposal to designate Taiwan as a major non-NATO US ally. There are, of course, two very big takeaways to take from this entire story and everything that happened regarding it over the last week. The first is that the East and West relations are getting worse and tensions are increasing. China wants to invade Taiwan, they want that island under their control, and the West obviously want to keep that island independent. But will it actually come to a head? Well, in my opinion, yes, it almost certainly will, even if not in terms of a hot war, of a physical confrontation, but without a doubt, we will at some point devolve into a trade war or an economic war over this issue. If it does go far enough to actually reach a hot war, that would absolutely be disastrous, as I'm sure you all know, and bad for pretty much everyone involved. We should, without a doubt then, expect tensions to get worse, not better. This will cause a whole load of other problems like inflation from supply side crises. Expect them to get worse as maybe export controls are put on goods coming out of China into the US. The other really big takeaway from this whole story, and something that most people really didn't expect, is that Xi Jinping actually looked a fair bit weak over the last week. He made loads of different threats about what would happen if the US did this, but then it turned out he was all bark and no bite. Now, this news here is coming out of China itself, not from the West, and this is bad for many different reasons. The Chinese populace has been worked up into a frenzy about this issue over the last week, and then the government did absolutely nothing to actually oppose the Americans, which is very unpopular on the ground. State-run media, which is basically the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party and is typically insanely pro-Communist Party, has been disappointed at the government's response, and they haven't been too kind about it either. Now, there's a very rare CCP meeting coming up, which will allow or not allow Xi Jinping to remain in power for another 5 years. He might try to look extra strong in the run-up to that meeting to try and ensure his success there, and this could see tensions rise exponentially over the coming weeks and months. Once again, this leads to further risks for trade wars, economic wars, diplomatic risks, and the real hot war risk as well. No one is absolutely sure where this is going to go, and this is all speculation, but it is without a doubt a little bit worrying. Next on the list of things that happened in China over the last week was that actually COVID-0 had another thing implemented to further this policy in China. Now, it's a very important policy in China, and it's one of the only countries in the world still actively pursuing this idea of no COVID cases whatsoever. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I think it is an absolutely idiotic policy and it makes no sense. COVID is now endemic, and even if the CCP were capable theoretically of eradicating COVID in their country in its entirety, well, it would just come back in from another country again. We also have the fact that vaccines just are not effective against this virus to get rid of it in its entirety, like we've seen with previous diseases like polio in the past, and so as a result, the lockdowns that China put into place are just shooting the country in the foot. When these cities or these regions are locked down, people are physically locked down. They're not allowed outside of their homes. Businesses and livelihoods are destroyed, and it's all basically for no good reason because there's no end point here. Now, this policy has now been in place for years, we all know that, but it's still going on right now, and over the last week, it didn't slow down at all. Sanya is a resort on the island of Hainan, and it's quite a popular tourist destination for Chinese people. It's sort of like China's Hawaii almost. Now, there are 80,000 tourists there right now, stranded on the island as it's been locked down because of COVID cases. All flights and trains into or outside of that region have been cancelled because they found 263 cases on an island of over 9 million people. Right now, as we speak, the island is fully isolated from the outside world and tens of thousands of tourists are absolutely stranded. The island itself has also shut down too to try and stop the spread of the virus. Restaurants, hotels, bars, activities, businesses, everything you can think of has been shut down. This is obviously going to have a massive direct economic hit to this region, to the island, to China as a whole, and to the tourist industry. But it's also going to have a massive physical impact on the people there as well. The social damage of lockdowns is literally incalculable at this point. Now, how long will this lockdown actually last? Now, that's a very difficult thing to say, but there is some degree of precedence here. A couple of months ago, we saw Shanghai get locked down for about 2 months in a similar sort of lockdown because they had a bunch of COVID cases. That one lasted for about 2 months. We've seen for a few weeks now, Wuhan has had a region of that city with 1 million people shut down over the last 2 weeks because they had 2 cases of COVID. It's very clear that actually the CCP wants to eradicate COVID in these regions, and they have very strict standards for this. For Hainan, for instance, they want people to have 5 negative tests over the last 7 days before they're allowed to leave the island, and obviously they're not allowed any positive tests in that time period at all. In my opinion, this specific lockdown on the island of Hainan could last for months without a doubt, and this is obviously going to economically impact the entirety of China. The worst thing about all this, though, is just the idea that there is no end in sight for this policy. There have been lots of rumors about the end to the zero COVID policy in China. People are saying that the Communist Party are aware and they know that it just doesn't work and it doesn't make sense in the long term, but their actions speak louder than their words and the lockdowns just keep coming. And so I really don't think this policy is going to end anytime soon. Macau is another massive city in China that has just opened up again after 0 cases in 9 days across the entirety of the city. But the problem here is the same as the problem we're seeing everywhere else. There are still other cases in China and in the rest of the world. And so at some point, someone with COVID will just simply walk back on into Macau and start the whole ordeal over again. In my opinion, though, what's really going on is actually something far more sinister. This isn't really about COVID anymore for the Communist Party. It's about the idea that the CCP was able to lock its entire populace down for months on end, and the populace actually let them. Now, the Chinese government is obviously a very authoritarian government, and they recently, over the last couple of years, gained more authority, and they want to ensure that they maintain hold of this authority forever as well. COVID is the perfect excuse to ensure that the people of China remain firmly under their boot forever. Every other week, a new city will be selected, seemingly at random, to be locked down to keep it normal in the newsfeed and to keep the populace subdued. Then, if there comes a point where serious civil unrest happens, if riots or an actual revolution happens to start, this will be so much easier for the CCP to combat because the populace will be so used to being locked down at that point. The economic and the social impacts of this awful policy are negligible to the CCP because all it really cares about is remaining in power. Now, of course, the Chinese economy as a whole is still suffering, and we've been speaking about this for over a year now on this channel. I said it was on its way over a year ago, and the bootlickers told me that I was wrong, but now the data is actually here to prove it, and over the last week, there were 2 main things that came to a head here. Of course, we have the property market collapse and the banking financial collapse, which are both ongoing. They've both been a long time coming. They were both industries which were massively over leveraged, and this was mostly based around the massive property bubble, which was actually the biggest financial bubble in the world over the last decade or so. Now, we all know of the big names like Evergrande, but there are hundreds of other multi-billion-dollar firms in the exact same sort of situation, and the Communist Party was for a long time trying and almost successfully actually stopping it all from collapsing, but in the end, this really was never going to be possible for them to contain this entire collapse. At first, the Communist Party just basically allowed companies to ignore foreign debt, to write it off and never pay it in the future with absolutely no consequences. The holders of this debt were usually foreign investors, people like Americans, so the Communist Party didn't care that they were finding themselves poorer, and they were trying to protect Chinese investors and the Chinese economy itself. But now China is having the exact same problem, but with domestic local debt from local investors, actual Chinese people. Evergrande has just been ordered to pay $1.1 billion to an investor that it couldn't pay last year, a domestic Chinese investor. Now, how will it pay that debt? Well, it's literally impossible for them to because they just have no cash and they have $300 billion worth of liabilities. This Chinese investor and every other Chinese investor invested in this bubble and this Ponzi scheme will lose everything, and this will have a monumentally large impact to their economy. Banks are already failing as a result of this, and it isn't going to stop anytime soon. What is actually clear, though, is that this decline in the property market and the collapse of the bubble is starting to hit the economy, and we're starting to see this in economic figures as well. Now, Alibaba is probably the single most successful company in China. It's basically the Amazon of China, and over the last quarter, for the first time in its entire history, its revenue actually declined instead of grew. This is as a result of loads of different things, but in general, there's been far less consumer spending on consumer goods in China from their domestic market. There's less demand across the board in China as well, in their advertising department, in their cloud computing department. Basically, everything is suffering. Alibaba have a finger in almost every single pie in China, and so this falling revenue is emblematic of a countrywide Chinese recession actually starting to kick off. We also, though, got a bunch of other data coming out straight from China, including new manufacturing data for the last month, and factory production actually fell in July and saw negative growth. Now, this isn't the first time that it's happened, but it was slightly unexpected, and it's not looking better for the future either. Property prices also fell last month, which means we've had about a year straight of property prices in China falling every single month. Domestic demand falling is a big reason for all of this bad data. China is a massive economy, and yes, it is still largely export driven, but there's also massive domestic demand, and it is now a consumer economy as well, with a massive consumer base, and that consumer demand is starting to fall, which is very bad. Things are clearly not very good in China, and they're not getting better each week either. We actually missed out a couple of things from this video this week because there was just so much to talk about, but there will of course be another video coming out next Sunday when we'll cover everything that happens over the next week, explaining the same thing and just why things are going so poorly in China. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. It really does help. If you want to join our exclusive community, then check out our Patreon. You get access to our Discord server and extra content like access to my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. Also, make sure to check out the link in the description to Masterworks. It can help you protect your portfolio against market turmoil through fractional shares of art from world-famous artists. Art has historically proven to be uncorrelated to the markets, so it's a really valuable resource with the markets falling every week. There's also a link in the description to I Trust Capital, which helps you to invest in crypto through your tax-advantaged IRA, which could literally save you thousands. If you, like me, think crypto going down is a buy-in opportunity, then now is the perfect time to join I Trust Capital. Thank you all for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.